writing. So, of writing from Korean people, but it is in Chinese. This is a picture of a replica, by the way. And it's dated, so we know it's from 414. We have an exact date. And the inscription is rather long. Today it stands in China, but at that time it was the capital of Korea. And it is one of the major sources of Korea's history. And it is written in Chinese only with some Korean proper names in between. So in opposition to this one was found in Gyeongsang province in 1935, and we don't know the date for sure because we have only the date written in the section generic cycle, but maybe it was written in 552, maybe 612, we don't know, around that time at least. It's not that long, only 74 characters, and it's a fully logographic writing in Korean, so it's similar to the inscription we have seen on the back of the halo of the Yakshi Nyorai inscription. And it looks like this. And again, this is on your handout, so I won't bother too much with the translation, which is also on your handout. So we have no phonograms, all logographic. We have the same features as we have seen in Japanese, like non-linear writing, sometimes Chinese word order, sometimes Korean word order, but we can still clearly identify it as a Korean text because of the word order and, well, the phonogram is kind of speculative, but we can get to that later. We have this character also, always following the Korean word order, never the Chinese word order. We have sentences like this is the one you find on the stone, and the one on the right, how it would be in Chinese. So these characters are the other way around with a preposition. Here we have verb object. So this is the object, this is the verb. Of course for Chinese it had to be the other way around. Well, this is strange, again, verb object, word order mix. Again, the same. So we see a pattern here. And again. And this one's probably a phonogram, maybe not. We can understand it from a Chinese viewpoint without necessarily having analyzed it a phonogram. But in the light of later texts, this is often used as a conclusive verb ending in Korean. So maybe this was used as this for the text as well. Maybe it's not a phonogram, so this should be put in parentheses maybe, or with a question mark at least. When it comes to writing Korean, it was done in the same way we've seen in the Manyoshi. So we have a mixed script of logographic and phonographic characters. And there was a rather big collection of Korean poems, some demo which is no longer extant, but which was probably a collection of 1,000 poems. And the other poems we have left are 14 poems from the Samguk Yusa, which is from the 13th century, but the poems are probably dating back way earlier. We have 11 more poems from the Kyungyeojeon, and one more poem from the Gyeongyakuritben. So let's take a look at one poem, which looks like this. And it looks, just from the way it was written, exactly like the one we've seen from Manyoshi. So we can see a direct influence there maybe. We don't have any proof for direct influence, but it's just likely that when texts in general came to Japan over Korea, that also the way of writing the own language, writing in the vernacular, was also a technique which was transmitted from Korea to Japan, because it's just very similar. Again, we have like the red logograms on the transcription with the capitals, and the blue phonograms written in small script, and the linguistic analysis and the translation which I got from NUM 2012. Also the morphological analysis, by the way. So what I just wanted to show here is that it's very, very similar to the Manyoshi. There are some differences, especially in the phonogram usage. For example, we have some phonograms writing syllable final consonants. We don't have that in Old Japanese, simply because there are no final syllable consonants. So the syllable structure was much more complex in Korean, so they had to deal with some extra difficulties. And for Japanese it was a little bit easier because the phonological structure of Old Japanese simply was easy. And we have dry point glossing. What is this? you can see very small dots here, which were impressed. So with no ink, they were just impressed. So we have red ink. In Japan, it was done with an impressed stylus. In Korea, it was also done in Japan, but it was very famous in Korea as well. So if we take this, for example, you can see we have a dot here, and a dot there, and another dot there. And they can hardly be seen, and that's a big problem. And when the paper gets older, of course, it gets more and more difficult to see those. So the discovery of those dry point glossing was only in the last 10 years, so it's a very new research. If we take this text, for example, we have some more. On the right, the dry point glossing marks are marked with the green color. So maybe I should. Oh, can I do this one? Yes. Can you see the mouse? Yes, you can. So if, for example, we have a line going down there, that means the red dot to the very left we have seen before, that this is a verb that has to be read later. So skip this and read later. This means this green line. Again, this is the verb. Go down, or actually go up, but read it later. Sometimes we have a line that goes first through the characters and then down. So this marks the compound. This is read together as a verb, and it is read after, because the Korean verb order first you have to read the subject. So this is very similar to the situation we have in Japanese, but just a little bit different technique. But basically this produces a Korean translation. This is one of the grids from the dry point glossing, which doesn't only have like maybe what we had before, like 8 or maybe 9 red dots. This is a character grid which looks a little bit more complex, and this is still open to debate. As I said, the research field is very young, but the glossing seems to be more complex than it was in Japanese, at least for one grid. So if we have a system with like 31 boxes, 31 grids, of course this is getting more complex in another way, but here the grid is simply more complex for one character. We have texts like Kuyong Imankyong, which was marked with similar to the Japanese fashion with phonograms in between. So this looks pretty much like katakana, but actually it's not. It's a Korean glossing, so we have Korean phonograms there. It was presumably written in the late Koryo dynasty, so in the 13th century. And 5 loose pages were only found from this much bigger text originally. So let's look into one small example. So again, this text is of course meant to be Chinese in the first place. And it was written as Chinese, it's a Chinese text, but then someone translated it. And he didn't bother to write the logograms again, so he only put in the phonograms. And the logograms were supposed to be written as Korean or as Sino-Korean then to produce the Korean text. So here we have phonograms. Red is Han. The base characters I put up there. And those phonograms are just abbreviated forms of these base characters. So exactly like the katakana, which go back to a more complex Chinese character, of course, though those ones get abbreviated. This one, yes, I meant it can be a little bit different for the phonograms, so that they can only sometimes write the consonant. So this writes only which is the genitive ending. So for Chinese we don't have like something like a j inside. For genitive we have nothing, but the Korean translation just tells us that this has to be this genitive. This one has a nominative, E. And this last one tells us to go up and read the left side. So a little bit different to the one situation we had in Japanese. It's a go up sign, but we read the left side, so it's quite convenient because we know where to go up, and not in the Japanese text where we don't know. We have to go up, but we don't know where the verb is sometimes, and it's more difficult. This is very convenient because we can then read the verb with the phonograms to the left of its side and read it as the perfected ending. So we get a parallel translation if we follow the phonograms, if we follow the inversion marks, to read this text not as Chinese. Oh yes, and sorry, the English translation. Also there exists the complete multitude of all living beings of 5 rooms, and the Middle Korean translation. If we want to write it out, it looks like this, and again this is on your handout. So they were using a very, very similar translation technique for Chinese texts. But we also have texts that look like this, that have indeed not only two parallel linguistic texts, but also two parallel written texts. This is originally a law codex from the Ming Dynasty. And first we have the Chinese, which goes like this, with a big characters, and then in double columns and in smaller script we have the Korean translation, which follows after it, so we don't have like one written text producing two parallel linguistic texts, but two texts between each other. But the outcome is the same. So let's look at this. The Chinese one and the Korean one right after it. So again, you can see from the colors, we have logograms, we have phonograms there. Sometimes we have some more logograms than that are actually there in the Chinese original. So the translation is a bit more free. It's a bit not so literal translation, it's a bit freer. But still it's a translation. And it clarifies the meaning, sometimes by adding more logograms, sometimes by adding more phonograms. So this technique was usually not done in Japan. They were also they were always using the same text. They were never producing like a real written parallel text by themselves. So we have a summary for Korea. We have the dry point glossing and the glossing with ink for reading and translating Chinese texts, like we have seen with those two. And we have seen a poem, which I don't have a picture for, and government text. Edo writing was usually for government text. And on your handout you have a little bit of an overview for all countries, not only for Korea, so you have this information as well on the handout. And then I have 5 more minutes, and that would probably be enough for Vietnam, because what about Vietnam? Yeah, I have to say that for me it's still in a very preliminary state. I'm doing more research on it myself and starting to get into it, so this is just very basic overview. What about Vietnam? And there's no similar technique to Kundoku found in Vietnam. The texts were written in the original literary Chinese language. But why is this the case for Vietnamese, and why is it not the case for Korean and Japanese? So let's look at the Vietnamese language. It's a Hmong Khmer language, or an Austroasiatic language. It has 6 tones, so a bit more than like at least the Mandarin variety, but it doesn't really matter for translating the text anyway. It's an isolating language that's just perfect. Chinese is also an isolating language. And the word order is the same. So why was it so difficult? And it is too difficult to have a Kundoku translation technique for Vietnamese. It's because of the last point. Because Vietnamese is head initial, unlike Chinese. So the modifier follows the modifier. And if someone would go for a similar technique of Kundoku for Vietnamese, there would be so many inversion marks that it would just be way too complex. So the only thing you need to change in basic word order for Korean and Japanese is just object verb, to swap those around. This is the only thing you need to change. But if it's generally a head initial language, you have to change so many things, it becomes absolutely impossible to use this technique. So they had to deal with the language as such and read the as Chinese, or translate, like we've seen in the Edo example, in the government text. But first, let's take a look at how they dealt with Chinese text as Chinese. They were still having some reading aids. This is a very new text from the 19th century, just a collection of poems from the Chijing commentary. So if we look at this text, again with a classic translation by Lecция from the 19th century, from the Chijing one poem, they were having some marks there, like the red lines to the red, which just generally tells you the lines, where they end, where they start. And sometimes you have this dot, and it means exactly the same as we have seen before in Japanese, so that these two are not meant to be read in the 4th tone as junjun, but rather as a junjun in the 1st tone. So little reading aids, but still they were reading it as literary Chinese text. The real problem comes now how to write Vietnamese, How did the Vietnamese write their own language? They also had no indigenous writing system, so the same for Korea and Japan. So they had to adapt the Chinese characters, and this was done in 2 steps. The first step was, again, similar to the one I think we have seen before, that they were using the Chinese characters phonograms, especially for proper names. But there was no mixed phonographic, logographic writing going on like in the Mayoshi or the Samguk-Yusa poems. And then the second step, they were inventing new characters, building new characters. So in Korea and Japan, they also built new characters after the formation rules of the Chinese characters. But it wasn't that important for writing Japanese. They were not using really many of those newly invented characters. Unlike in the Vietnamese script, which we are going to look a little bit more in depth right now. And from the beginning of the 20th century in Vietnam, they use a modified version of the Roman alphabet, so no more Chinese characters in Vietnam today. Again, that starts out with first epigraphic inscriptions from the 10th century, rather late. Probably there were some sooner ones, but none of them are extant. This is an inscription from the Hotan Mountain from the 14th century. We have here an example of a Chinese character used as phonograms exclusively for writing a personal name. Looks a little bit strange, especially here with the dots, so it begins that they were adapting Chinese characters to actually write their own language in their own way. But before we go to that stage, we are still at the first stage of, at the first step of writing Vietnamese, so using them as phonograms. For example, in this one work from the 15th century, probably from the 15th century, we have a parallel text. We first have the literary Chinese original, and the translation by Taylor, and we have the Vietnamese translation, which is parallel text again. First the Chinese comes, then the Vietnamese comes, and which is using mostly Chinese characters as phonograms, and in one case we have here red mark, the logogram, but usually we have only phonograms at this step. And again, from a Chinese viewpoint, it doesn't make any sense to read this Chinese. It's clearly Vietnamese, so no non-linear writing going on in Vietnamese at all. So the thing we've seen in Korea and Japan, non-linear writing doesn't exist in Vietnam. A little bit of history. The Vietnamese independence lasted quite a long time, 1,000 years, so the Vietnamese language changed a lot during that time. And some are arguing that it became isolated because of this Chinese domination during such a long time. It was usually a bit different before. Yes, we've seen that. And writing Vietnamese proper, so not only proper names and stuff like that, but really longer text flourished, especially during the very short-lived Ho dynasty, which was only 7 years long, and then again Ming occupation fell in. And burning of books and printing blocks destroyed quite a lot of material. So that's the reason why we have like very scarce material for Vietnam before the 15th century. And the peak of literature in the newly invented script, the Junong, was during the 18th, 19th century. But also during this time we have an edict extant from the beginning of the 18th century that tells us that the script was looked down upon and that it has no good reputation, and that Chinese, of course, was the high register way of written language as such. The script was never standardized and had a great variety of characters, we see on the next slide, and a proposal got actually rejected by the emperor in the 19th century. So it didn't stand under good light at all. So how did the second step of Vietnamese writing look like? We have this character in Chinese, Middle Chinese again, la, the meaning is net. In Vietnamese we can use it for the sound value alone, but we can also then again read it as a logogram only to write the word to be, which has the same meaning, and then in the second step it was only used for this one and the sound value was not important anymore. So it became a new logogram, it was only used for this one. This character was first used in Chinese to write the verb to sing, what? And we have a Vietnamese loanword, which is similar, like mod, very similar to sing. This was then used for the phonetic value only, and this was in turn used for the Vietnamese word one, which is which has the same pronunciation as to think, and became then a new phonogram to write only this and never only as a syllable mod, but in every case with the same meaning. And one last example, and here we can see the building of a new character, because this one was first in Chinese used for hand line, which in turn then was used for its phonetic value, which in turn then was used for a Vietnamese word, so was becoming a logogram. But we also have this one with the meaning of ba in Middle Chinese. And they build a new character, putting those two together. So this is quite convenient, because if you only have this character and you want to read it, well, you have the sound value, you know that it's read as ma, that's no problem. But this tells us the meaning and the pronunciation at once, and this is quite handy. And this is what they were mostly doing with their script from then. So this became the new character to write this. The problem was that at one stage, at one point in time, all those three possibilities were used at the same time. And this is what the great variation of characters is about. So if you take this text, for example, which is a Vietnamese text now, not a Chinese text anymore. This is my last example, and then I will finish. Which looks like this. We see several of characters we can't identify from Chinese viewpoint. Let's just find some, like for example this one doesn't exist in Chinese. These look quite strange here, and you can find many things you wouldn't expect. Here you can see like a small hook next to it. Here you can see a reading, I come back to that later. So many strange peculiar characters. This one we usually don't see. This is strange again. Oh, here we have our example from the last page.
Sorry, what about that small circles? Some tone markers or...
Oh, this one. This is like for the sentence final.
Full stop.
Yes, full stop. Yes. So sometimes you have a reading like the furigana in Japanese. You can also have the reading like in the Roman alphabet next to it. So you have this word together, and then you have like h as a phonetic to the right of the character. But actually you want to have another pronunciation, so the vowel differs here. The character is not to be read as h, but to read as ho. And therefore you have the reading next to it to make it more clear. And just the diacritics, you sometimes have this hook to say, read this as Vietnamese and not as Chinese. So you have the sign of Vietnamese loanword, ko, but you also have then to have with the diacritic next to it with the different vowels, so ko versus ko. And to make it even clearer, you don't need the diacritic, you can create a new character and have like, again, the meaning and the phonetic in one character. That means then only to have. So while this is ambiguous, you can read it with the meaning solid or to have. These are clearly only to have and never solid. And for this one, again, you can have the diacritic with the only exception that usually this diacritic tells you to read it as Vietnamese. But these are in fact both Sino-Vietnamese readings. But this is not considered to be Sino-Vietnamese anymore because it's a very early loan. So the Vietnamese people were considering this to be Vietnamese, but in fact it goes back to an older stratum of the Chinese loan. And they were using the diacritic for this to tell you, read it as Vietnamese, but actually it's just a very old loan from Chinese. And the last slide. It was never standardized, and we can see that again by the example of this character. You can read the Sino-Vietnamese as la to be, or Vietnamese ja as to get out. This one you can also read in both versions. This one you can only read in the Vietnamese reading because of the diacritic here. Sometimes you, or maybe you don't want to call this diacritic even, sometimes you have the hook here, sometimes the put like a mouth radical to the left, and basically it's the same function as the hook we've seen before. You can create a new character to make it more clear that this is supposed to be to get out and not anymore this one to be, but only this one. But this one again, you can make it easier to write. And this was not only done in handwriting, but also in printed books. And you can make it like this, and make it even shorter. And at one point, all those variants were used at the same time. So it was rather complex, and maybe this was one of the reasons why it never got really standardized. It was discontinued in use. So thank you very much for your attention. Спасибо за внимание. And of course, if you have any questions now, I'm more than glad to answer. So what you can find on your handout are basically all the examples I had from writing your own languages, so writing Japanese, writing Korean, and writing Vietnamese. I didn't put in the Kundoku examples, so the Chinese writing for the countries, for 3 countries. And on the last separate paper, you have like a basic overview of literacy. So, yes, yes, please.
Yes. Sorry, I've got a small question.
Yes.
That you, do you know whether there are any dictionaries published so far which actually discern between Vietnamese version of the same character and the Chinese its Chinese origin and its Japanese and Korean versions? Yes, whether any dictionaries which may be of some help
Like
to us.
Cross-linguistically for all languages, no. There are, of course,
I mean
dictionaries.
cross-language dictionaries.
Yes, there are none. No. There are dictionaries, of course, for Vietnamese characters, for Korean. For
Separate.
Japanese. Yes, but no
I see.
one is. I don't know of any.
No comparative studies.
No.
I see. Thank you.
At least I don't know. It would be interesting.
Okay.
Sorry. One question about the order. Different subclasses of content markers
Yes.
emerged in Japanese script. So now we have some content markers indicating some verb endings or case markers or whatever. Then we have some inversion marks and perhaps some marks functionally some functional equivalence of modern punctuation. So what is the order the different subclasses emerged in Japanese script?
Basically the order was like I tried to show in the presentation. So at the first stage we have the red okototen. So at the same time we have the syntactic inversion marks marked by the red dots and the phonographic glosses marked by the red dots. So this was basically the first stage.
Perhaps
If I understood you correctly.
yes, yes. As far as I remember, perhaps that was stated by Seeley, or I don't remember exactly, that some marks functionally representing some modern punctuation can be actually observed in the earliest Japanese inscriptions. Perhaps even those brought directly from Korea, and the marks indicating some verb endings and case markers and K-10 as well emerged after that. So the sequence was the idea is that some highly peripheral punctuation marks emerged earlier than the marks representing some grammatical items.
Well, at least for Japan, we cannot say that. So at the very earliest stage of dealing with Chinese text, reading translation of Chinese text, we have both already.
Yes, well, that's an incredibly interesting problem. I can send you
Yes.
the reference if I find it.
Yes, I mean, maybe the reason for that was because it was already alone by the Korean scribes, by the Korean translators, and they had a system ready already. So when they were bringing the first text over to Japan, they were bringing the translation technique over as well. So we're just copying that, and of course, like developing it further. But the basic idea was most definitely alone from Korea as well. So not only the Chinese writing Chinese script, but also the way of dealing with the translation of this. Yes. Thank you.
Are there any special marks represented both in Japanese and Korean? Like for the order? Or
Yes. For example, we had the small hook which tells us to swap around the characters. That was, for example, done in Korean as well, and it was done in China as well.
So how can you distinguish them between Japanese and Korean?
If you only have
Geographically?
if you only have inversion marks, theoretically no, because the syntax of Korea and Korean and Japanese is basically it's so similar you can't distinguish. So when we find a text in Japan, we know it's Japanese, and then if we find it in Korea, we know it's Korean. If we only have inversion marks, but usually you not only have inversion marks, but also phonographic glosses, and then it's
Some
clear
other
which language it is. Yes.
glosses.
But for example, we had the this one epigraphic inscription on stone, the Korean one, which shows which has only logographic, like I can show, which has only logographic writing of Korean, and it shows like the word order, nothing more, nothing less, no phonograms. Okay. This one. So just from it looks, if we have found this stone in Japan, it would be Japanese. Because we have found it in Korea, it's Korean. But we can't, at this stage, we can't decide which language it is. It's difficult.
So what about that white space between?
Yes, it's there for a reason, because it's
So
this one. So they were marking the sentence that it ends at this point. This is very unusual, like for Chinese text. So this was an invention from the Korean scribes to mark a sentence by leaving a blank space. This was something special.
And how widely circulating these kind of texts were. For example, we know that in this, obviously, it was not the main, just dominating system, right? Because, for example, for the Tiganum, that's in Japanese, it's obviously attracted to this kind of thing, but it's never, although despite all this kind of, just kind of beneficials from this kind of writing system, it never got absolutely dominant and really popular, and was not able to overcome the Chinese writing system. So it's still writing.
So you mean the writing in the vernacular as such?
Writing
Yes.
in vernacular as such, so it was used kind of randomly. It was kind of used kind of like a random system because of this many comprises, and it was evaluated from this point of view. It was by the distance it was getting, it was having this kind of gap between